Even out there, Dan here, aka the Comic Concierge. This is one of my graphic thoughts videos. This is where I go through 3 graphic novels, trades, or mangas that I've been reading and giving you my thoughts and opinions about them. Don't worry, I won't go into any major spoilers. However, if you're concerned at all, although the majority of books I'm talking about this week are somewhat based upon true stories and history, so I guess spoiler for real life. But anyways, ultimately, if you're concerned, down below you will find chapters and timestamps there for you, so you need to worry about that. But let's get to the books we'll be talking about this week. First up, we have Teddy. Next up, we have Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed. And lastly, we have I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. Let's get to the first book we're going to talk about this week, which is Teddy. And this is written by Lawrence Lickerberg with art by Eric Tate. And this is, again, about Teddy Roosevelt and his life. But it's framed in this interesting way where it's about him at a moment in his life in which he was about to give this speech. To complicate matters, right before he is about to give this speech, he gets a telegram, and it's a telegram about his son. At this time, during this period, we are in the midst of World War I, and he gets a telegram notifying him that his son is, in fact, missing in action, presumed dead. His son was a airline pilot, for World War I during the early years of the Air Force, if you even want to call him that. His plane went down, and some people think that maybe he did survive. Some of the fellow pilots feel like he was able to crash land and maybe was taken prisoner. Others do fear that he was actually killed in action. So he has this mighty weight on his shoulders right before he's about to give this speech to this eager audience, and he's debating about, does he do it, does he not? And he ends up going through with the speech, kind of hiding the fact that he has this news kind of hovering over him. And within the speech, it's this kind of look back at his entire life. This, in a way, it's a complicated or different way of doing a biography of him from his early years to the present of this moment, all told through his perspective, to his point of view, because again, it's about the speech that he's doing. So that framework, I think what it allows it to feel is much more, emotional. You feel like it's much more of an intimate tale rather than you're just giving a lot of facts about him, just your typical autobiography. Well, this happened and this happened, by it feeling like it's actually his words on the page, his this is his point of view. You feel like this is actually a story that has an emotional weight to it. And Teddy Roosevelt as a figure is a fascinating human being. His life is full of just oddities and strangeness, and he's left a full life for sure. There's a reason why he's on the Mount Rushmore, the actual Mount Rushmore of presidents, in large part due to the fact that, the guy who made that was a fan of him and kind of his friend. But beyond that, Teddy Roosevelt has left his mark on United States history, and it gets to that. But I think by using this framework of him, dealing with the fact that his son's death is a possibility, you see him kind of reworking his life and questioning some things, and generally you see that his life has been full of tragedy. In fact, this isn't even the first time he's dealt with death in his family in such a strong way. You see some early years where he was just this general guy in the New York State Senate. He meets this woman who he eventually falls in love with and becomes she becomes his wife. Fast forward, they're having their first child, and his wife actually dies in childbirth, and he kind of sets off to the West at that time to become a rancher, I think, to kind of run away from what was happening to him, kind of leaving his daughter at that time with his sister-in-law to be raised. And if there's one thing, I feel like it didn't reckon with that nearly enough. And maybe, again, because it's this perspective, if you didn't want to highlight on that failure, it kind of gets that to the end because you're dealing with more of his act of being a father. But it is, that's a brash decision to make. You're leaving, your wife dies, obviously that's going to have an impact on you and the child that you bear. You're just kind of leaving it behind, trying to find ways to support it, to be fair, like trying to raise these cattle in the early settlement days of the later settlement days of the West, as the West is just about to kind of be no longer the Wild West and be much more settled. But you see also his life is dealt with a lot of failure. He was also a type of figure that would rub people the wrong way. And he didn't necessarily initially want to be part of government, but he saw things weren't working the way they should. And he saw that there's just so much corruption at that time, and not like that's changed that much. But you do feel like, if anything, just because you're seeing it through his point of view, It does feel like a bit of a romanticized version of these tales. It talks about his time with the Rough Riders and what he went through. Although I will say that, like, my imagination, my thought of like what I've heard about the Rough Riders was much different than this, where you make it seem like he was the person that led the charge from the beginning, but you realize that wasn't necessarily the case. Like he eventually, was the person that helped him go up San Juan Hill in that famous moment, but ultimately, like, the reason he was put in that situation is because there was so many people that were killed in action that were just kind of over their heads in a way. And you also see that he becomes president kind of by accident at first. He was this guy that would cause a lot of trouble. He was, the assistant director for the Navy, nearly by himself. Although I didn't touch upon this, I was hoping it would, like how much his influence actually led to the American-Spanish War. And because of the infamous "Remember the Maine" kind of debacle, where the United States thought the Maine ship was blown up by the Spanish, but that wasn't actually. It was this whole debacle that gets into things like yellow journalism and things. It's one of my more interesting parts of U.S. history that this didn't touch upon, which I was a little bit disappointed that we get into kind of like how much he impacted that war as an individual, but. Nevertheless, it is talk about how he does become president, and a big reason he was even becoming president was because he was just annoying people to a great extent that they're like, how can we kind of put him in a situation where he won't bother anyone? He has no power to do anything, and they made him vice president because at that time, being a vice president was pretty pointless. Even I guess you would argue more so than it is now, where there's actually a lot more at stake. At that time, vice presidents didn't really have much say or didn't much do anything to any great extent. They weren't, people having like great press conferences or leaving the charge of anything. They were just kind of this position that was there, and what was there wasn't necessarily a job of great importance. However, because McKinley is assassinated, he then becomes president, and he becomes a president that is maybe not the type of person a lot of people would like, because he's very brash in the way he approaches things, and he's a lot of opinions and a lot of policies that really annoyed a lot of people on all sides, really. He was a Republican, although by today's standards, I don't think he would necessarily qualify, because he had a lot of progressive ideas. He was very much, again, pro the environment, going back to his time, being a rancher. He wanted to do a lot to preserve the United States beauty. I mean, national parks are big. He's a big reason behind that. It gets into a lot of his policies, but this wasn't really a policy book. This wasn't necessarily a book about his time as president in the sense of like, how does he shape the country? It was more about the personal relationship with him and his family. And where I think it's most interesting is when it focuses on that. And it talks about like him being a father and those challenges. And you certainly see, again, the failures that he was really aware of, and the fact that he did basically have a daughter that he didn't raise. But when he gets has another family, gets a new wife, and they have kids, and the relationship that blooms there, and his desire to be a father. You also see that, like, as he left the presidency, there's a lot of things he wanted to get accomplished. There's a running theme of failure in a way, where he had he was concerned about his kids going off into this war, into World War I, going to the president, actually trying to become an officer again to help lead a charge. And you see that in his later years, this guy who was known for, someone shot him, and he continued to give a speech because he like wouldn't back down for much of anything. That really started to wane in his earlier years. He kind of had to have a tail between his legs in some moments, and then he again is dealing with a lot of tragedy near the end, and you're seeing a lot of that regret as the speech starts to wrap up, looking at kind of seeing the negative consequences to some of his action. There was some honesty in there. So despite the fact that I do feel like at times it did maybe romanticize him a bit, wasn't as critical, I think it makes a little bit more sense because you're seeing it through his point of view, and you do at least see by the end him struggling with a lot of the choices, a lot of the state of the world, and being in a point where he can't necessarily do much about it. Like, what do you do when you're the president of the United States, and then that's the last job you have, and now the world is going a certain direction, and you don't have the ability to change it anyway. Like, your voice is not what it once was, despite the fact that you held that office at one point in time. So that certainly was intriguing, and as a person that is a fan of history, it was interesting kind of getting more context for that. The art is pretty solid as well. It's very character focus. It doesn't necessarily. It's all about telling the story, and the people look like they really should. The cartooning is generally strong. It's easy to follow. This is a good book for people that probably don't necessarily read a lot of comics. I could see this putting in a lot of like high school shelves, for example, where you don't want to watch or read a textbook about Teddy Roosevelt. Here's a book, even if you're not super apt in the language of comics, it does everything for you. So I think that certainly it's function over form again with this book. And this comes from Dead Reckoning, which is a publisher some may not be aware of, but actually is a publisher part of the Naval Academy. So this makes sense. And they publish a lot of books all geared towards history, especially United States history, military history, and Teddy Roosevelt has a huge part of military history. And that also makes me wonder, maybe that's just my preconceived notion, knowing it's coming from someone that you would think would be on the side of romanticizing the United States role in certain situations because it has that Naval Academy allegiance. I will say I've read other books from this publisher that I feel like are very fair and balanced when it comes to dealing with historical context and making sure that the true story is being told. It's not super heavy in the propaganda, like the rewriting history to favor one side over the other. This one, again, I think it's probably a little bit more polished than others, but I think generally, at least I understood where it was coming from because of the design of it. So, and the biggest benefit, I think, why I enjoyed this more than some other historical comics I've read is because you do have that emotional element, and I do think the framing device is effective in that manner, so it doesn't feel as dry. So even people I think that are not huge fans of history, that's not something that you really care all much about, at least we'll get something on that line. But I think ultimately, though, this is made for those that are interested in learning more or interested in Teddy Roosevelt. It's never going to like revolutionize what you think about him in a great degree. This is all taking place mostly in one speech, so there's not a lot of depth to here. It's a pretty large in scope because it's covering a lot of his life, but because of that, you're not getting into the minute details. So, but like I said, I do think it would be like if you have a high schooler that has to do a report on Teddy Roosevelt, this is a good thing to read because I think it covers a lot of his life. And it at least gives you a better picture of who he was outside of just like the historical figure, who the person was outside of the person that's carved inside of a mountain. So there you go. But those are my general thoughts on this. So let's get to my next book. The next book we're going to talk about is Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed. And no, that's not a threat. That is the name of this book. And when I do look at these books, I do try to see, are there any connecting elements with the books I'm talking about each week? And with this week, it is a lot of books that deal with nonfiction. These are all based on true stories or retellings of actual history. And that's, again, of course, the case with Teddy and the case with Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed. This is written and drawn by Rachel Marie Crane Williams, and it comes from the University of North Carolina Press. And it's about the center story, where it's all leading up to, is a revolt, or basically a race riot in Detroit in June of 1943. When I first saw this, I actually thought like, oh, it's just going to cover the same night, the same famous night that was done in the Detroit movie, which was done by Catherine Bigelow a few years ago. And it's not. It's a different time. It just shows you how much racial uprising there's been in the United States, that you can have so much dedicated to the issue in the same city in very different decades. But this taking place in 1943, one thing we don't talk about, I think, at that time a lot is what were things like and actually on the home front in the United States. We talk a lot about World War II. I mean, there's so much coverage of World War II, but what life was like at the home front is, I think, glossed over in a great deal. And what this gets into, and I think that the biggest strength of this, like the one thing I think about, is just the amount of context this gives. And this is about one specific period, this period of time in June of 1943. But it takes a while to get there, because I think you need to understand what led up to this issue, what led up to this explosion of violence and police brutality during this first few days. And it's a long story dating back really to the Civil War, but getting into, as you were seeing, a lot of influx, a lot of people, a lot of African Americans leaving the cities, leaving the country of the South, moving north, moving to cities to try to find jobs. One place people went to was Detroit. And it caused a lot of conflict, of course, because you had a lot of people that did not want people that did not look like them living near them. So you had a lot of things put into place when it came to housing, and certain sections were basically designed for these. This is the white section, this is the black section, and there was a new housing projects that would go up, and there's a lot of fight over, no, this is the one that the white people want because it's closer to our other neighborhoods. There was this huge, before we even get into the riots of 1943, a lot of protests and things like that. When you had the Sojourner Truth, like home development area that was designed for the influx of African Americans that were coming in, and a lot of white people didn't want that. They wanted those houses for themselves, so they were protesting, and it caused a huge upheaval. And it was this conflict that was ever going. It just kind of never ceased. And then as more people came, the other problem was one, you had a lack of housing. A lot of people were living in small houses with a large group of individuals because there was just no place to live, and they were segregated to certain areas that were certainly designed to not have the greatest functions in the world, due to the sheer amount of racism at the time. And then beyond that was the issue of jobs. This is at a time, of course, World War II is going on, and a lot of Ford factories were being converted to make weapons, make tanks and things like that outside of just making cars. And it's a great opportunity, you think, to get jobs. So that's what we hear a lot, right? It was like part of the reason the Great Depression ended was because of World War II opened the doors, and we had a lot of places making weaponry, Rosie the Riveter and things like that. But what you saw in Detroit were, despite the fact that there was kind of a labor shortage in a way, there was still a huge amount of conflict in the labor department. Henry Ford at first, and a lot of organizations wouldn't hire Black workers for certain jobs, or when they did, it was usually kind of jobs like on the janitorial side, low paying work that no one else would want. So you had a huge amount of people that were unemployed or unable to get work, that were scraping by with the lack of workforce, especially for African American women. They would barely hire them for anything. However, this is also the time where unions were beginning to rise, and Henry Ford was having a lot of conflict with the unions. And one way he would get around it when people started to strike was he would hire African Americans, because he thought he could hire them, pay them less, and not have to deal a way to get around people striking, which again, that gave people jobs, but it just raised racial tensions again, because a lot of people that were part of those unions felt that their jobs were being taken away, and they were losing their power. But at the same time, those people were taking those jobs because that's all they could get. That was, finally they had a job. So Henry Ford was using, basically the race conflict in his favor to fever this conflict even further. And you had issue upon issue upon issue that kept growing. That was just kind of part of it. And I think that is the benefit of this, is that it does give you a lot of context. I will say, and you get to like some personal stories as well to provide context of that history. So it's not just this happened. Here's an individual, here's their story. And I will say, if I had any issues with it, I do feel like the art is okay. There's some times where the figure design feels a bit off. Like they lack the humanity that you need in moments when you're having these kind of devastating things on the page. Sometimes just the figure design isn't quite there to make those moments work. The cartooning is, I think, average, where the historical context and the research is kind of the best part of this. The actual art itself, it's not necessarily awful. It's just not the strength of the book per se. Like I don't necessarily know, why make this book into a comic. Like why I decide to do this in comic form rather than book form, or maybe even documentary form. I do think the benefit of it is that you do get those personal stories, and you have the combination of, history, personal take, as well as some sort of imagery to kind of link them. But the issue is the imagery wasn't as strong at times to make that decision worthwhile, to make it as strong as necessarily, at least in my opinion. But it was fascinating to learn, because again, this was a part of history that I don't think we covered that great. And I do think having those personal stories in there gave it a little bit more of, again, similar with Teddy, an emotional contact. So it doesn't feel like just words on the page, that you have persons and people that it's affecting, and from all sides of point of view. I am a fan of documentary comics. I don't know if that's what you would want to call them, but this one, again, it's another one I would certainly recommend. If just, be warned that maybe the art isn't at the strongest point of view, but if you can kind of get used to it and just understand what's really being said, I think generally the purpose of it goes beyond some of my quibbles, some of my minor quibbles with the book. All right, the last book I'm going to talk about this week is I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. And I'll just say it out forefront. I absolutely love this book on pretty much every degree. This is up there. These are all 2020 graphic novels, I should mention. And this is up there as one of my favorites of the year, near my top five. It's of all the comics I've read thus far. Not to just put up a bunch of hyperbole praise on a book that would hopefully not disappoint people if they actually read it. But why did I love this? This is by Manny Murphy, and there are so many reasons why this book works for me. But I think generally it comes down to the craft, and the craft in two cents. So it starts off as this book that it's about this dedication to River Phoenix, the actor who was in things like Stand By Me, and his life and his death. At first, I'm like, it's interesting to do a biography of River Phoenix. He's kind of like a James Dean of his time. He had a major impact on Hollywood. He had a tragic death, and it gets into his history, and you learn about him, and his family, how they're a part of this cult, and have these kind of strange beliefs. And the entire book is done in this format where it's like taking those papers that you would get in elementary school, those 3-line papers, and it's written like in a journal-like format with then imagery on each page. And I was kind of wondering like why make that decision, because generally what this book is, at the root of it, it's just kind of the failure of youth, the failure to, I think, provide youth a safe passage into understanding the world around them, or kind of pushing them through a certain point of view that's going to lead to just their ultimate destruction or destruction around them. And it may seem like brash, like how do you go from there, from River Phoenix and his life, to like a granular or this larger scope of the entire world, or at least this area. And it does it in I think, a rather impressive way, because it happens in like the focus shifts, like you're learning about River Phoenix. And I actually wouldn't be against an entire book with him, because I enjoy Stand By Me. It's a great film, and certainly there's a lot to his life, but a lot of it takes place in Portland, and you see his upbringing, and then it starts to shift further and further to kind of go beyond just River Phoenix and the area itself, and to the history of Portland and Oregon in general, and like where it comes from, and just the deep-rooted racism that exists within the region. And from the beginning, like how when it was first established, like there was a lot of racist roots at the time, that not just against Native Americans, but like really anyone who wasn't white. It was kind of designed as this white bastion for the world, and it remained that. Like a lot of regulations that were put on limiting those that could travel or live in the area when they would come into like ports and things like that you basically, if you weren't white, you couldn't live there. And eventually those things went away when you just needed the labor force. But when people, similar to the Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed, the housing was certainly segregated to an extreme extent, and then because of that, education and schools were poorly designed, and people that, based upon your race, was a big indication of the type of education you would get. But then you saw a lot of kind of sparing up of like, that went away to some degree. But in the 90s, during the time, River Phoenix was rising, you saw again this increase of white nationalism throughout the area, even in like teenagers at the time. I think in large part because it gets into the school the author went to, and it was this kind of unschooling school where you were taught to question authority to a great extent, but almost to an extreme extent. There's an example of like how there's basically no structure whatsoever in their schools, and while they had that fundamental aspect of questioning authority, it led them with an education that I think was a bit lacking, and to the point that they had no direction, and that lack of direction led a lot of people to make some decisions to get with some groups that were rather notoriously hateful, but it gave them that sense of direction. And also even talks about an episode of the Geraldo Rivera show where like how it was used to kind of put the message out there of white nationalists and the KKK. It was this famous episode of television where you had people on the stage and there were openly white nationalists, and it led to a huge brawl. It led to like Geraldo Rivera getting his nose broken, and it's this famous episode. If you YouTube it, you'll see a lot about it. But how that kind of their goal there was to cause chaos and to spread their message, and it was extremely effective because what people thought was like, oh, we're exposing them, was the opposite. It really just allowed their message to spread to a greater degree. And it was, they said like, no press is bad press. And that's the case even if you're a hate group. But what I just found fascinating generally though was the craft, because talking about how this was a book designed with these 3-letter, old school journal pages, it ties to me into just that kind of failure of youth, because the book is written as if it is this document of someone's youth, kind of seeing the world around them through that perspective, through the child's eyes, and just seeing the failures over and over again of basically adults unable to do the job that they need to lead them in the right direction, whether it be parents, teachers, police officers. This continuous failure just led to this massive element of toxicity. You have River Phoenix, for example, a lot of people going to drugs, and a lot of reason River Phoenix went to drugs is because he had family that was generally kind of messed up in a lot of ways. He was basically part of this cult, and it led him to down this path of destruction, which eventually killed him. And then you see that's universal. Some people, that was a path of death. Some of it was a path of hate. And I just found it extremely fascinating just how it progressed. That was to me, the biggest piece of this was just like how it all ties together really seamlessly, like how it goes from one topic to the next, and without really even noticing it. And you think it'd be this huge tonal shift or this huge shift in the narrative where it would become obvious, but I thought it was really impressive in how it kind of gradually went there. And that's something I do tend to find impressive with stories, when you can start in one direction and end up in something completely different, whether it be the style or tone of a story. Like one of my favorite movies is Bong Joon-ho's Mother from 2009, 2010. It opens beginning with the titular character kind of dancing, and it's a sweet looking dance. Like you're almost like, oh, this is going to be kind of this fun, enjoyable film. And at first there is a lot of humor to it, but it's in book it then with Mother dancing, and it's the same scene, but with a completely different tone, because the movie has shifted to an extreme extent to something that is much different than it began. And it was just emphasized and encapsulated in those two bookends. And this is something that was something similar in the sense of tonally, it doesn't necessarily change, but story-wise, it does. And I just thought the ability to shift that was well done. And then tying it thematically into the actual design of the book itself. Like this is a book, I'm not usually an advocate of you have to get physical copies, but reading this in physical form, to me, made it feel like I was understanding the theme of it much more. Like even the pages itself, like you would have, when you would write on that paper and things would bleed through, and on the other side, even though like the page itself, it didn't bleed through, they would take the bleed through page and put it on and like paste it on the next page. So it was like you were reading the actual journal. Those little bits, I felt like it made it feel like beyond just a regular comic book. Like this was the actual document you're reading. This was the journal that you're reading, that you weren't reading something that was designed for the masses, but someone's own personal story that you just picked up in a way. Just those little touches, I think, added a bit. Like, they talk about with like spoof comedies, where your spoof comedy, the best types of spoof comedies are ones that feel like if you're spoofing an action film, you're just as much of an action film as an actual action film, just with additional comedy. And this, to me, not that it's a spoof, but by adding those additional elements, it doesn't feel like it's something that's aping a certain design just for aesthetic reasons, but thematic reasons that make it feel like there's more weight there. So all those little pieces, why I ended up really loving it. And I went through this book really quickly. I ended up reading it twice because despite the fact it's relatively wordy, because again, it's almost like prose style in its fashion, and it's also written in cursive. And I don't remember the last time I read cursive, but I just found that the personality in the book was rather impressive, and everything about it was just, if you're a huge River Phoenix fan, or you're just interested to learn about, the state of Oregon and especially the Portland area, it makes a lot of things make sense in a way. Like make another movie reference. There's that movie Green Room, that, it takes place in like rural Oregon, that deals a lot with actual Nazis itself. And I always wondered, like, why is that area so notorious for that? Like, why is Pacific Northwest so well known for kind of being a bastion for hate groups like this? And this kind of explains why and where the history comes from. So again, I feel like the bad part is all the books I brought this week were rather huge downers. Unfortunately, well told stories, well researched, interesting, but it's ones that, like, if you're a person that just like is bombarded with sad news or things that are just awful right now in the world, and you want to escape from that. These are not books that will do that, but if you just like reading things that are good or interesting, like I mentioned, this is by far the best thing I read, without question. Anyways, those are my thoughts on my books this week. Thank you for taking the time to check out my channel. I appreciate that. Let me know what you thought about this books if you're interested. What are you reading? What are some books you'd like me to do a review on? Let me know in the comment section below. I do know there's a ton of comic book channels out there, so I appreciate any comment, any view, any reaction I get. Thank you so much for that. But just remember, comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, keep reading.